Normally, I'm only 200 years old. I just, let's see, what can I use to hold it up here? Let me look. Hold on, I'll be back in 20
It's
seconds.
okay. It's okay. Take your time.
All right, I found a cardboard box filled with wine glasses. Nothing could be more appropriate than that. If I can get this to stay closed. On here. Right. Camera goes up. And I'll turn that on now. Camera. And work on that angle. There. Okay.
Yeah.
High enough or higher?
Okay, it's great. I just start recording.
Okay. There, I can actually see now.
Can I have you a little bit more right here? Yes, yes, yes.
Well, I can just turn the camera. That's easier to do.
Yes, yes, it's great. And also, I want you above, if it's okay. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's great. Yeah, thank you. Okay, whenever you're ready, we can start.
I'm ready.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Duff, thank you for your time. Thank you for accept our invitation. As a first question, in this week we had, I think, two news about collapsing a building in Florida and also a bridge in Washington, D.C. And also before that, we heard so many documentaries, news about aging infrastructure in the United States. What is the problem? Why this is problem for the United States as a first economic in the world?
Well, the issue in the U.S. During the last years of the Obama administration, the U.S. spent about $2 trillion on infrastructure, which is more than the budget for the entire, except for China, the entire planet. The problem with infrastructure is not so much well, how to explain this? It's generally corruption in the United States. The building industry has for years been controlled by the sale of concrete and steel. The steel industry in the U.S. has been controlled by a cartel, but the concrete has been controlled openly by organized crime. for a very long time. As can be seen in the relationship between Trump and his mobster friends, when the last large concrete building in the United States was built, Trump Tower. You know, we don't build concrete-only buildings. We build buildings that have some concrete, but are generally all steel frame. And we've been forced to do this. We use very little concrete because not only do we have to pay enormous fees to organized crime for concrete, but we often get concrete that's dangerously substandard, filled with sand, made with really fake Portland cement. So we have bridge collapses, we have apartment building collapses, and they're generally tied to corrupt officials and the sale of defective concrete. And I believe that's one of the factors that would have been involved in Miami, and probably a very significant one. The other one, and it's one that's ignored, but there was a powerful 10 kiloton explosion offshore, about 80 miles offshore, about 10 days before. The U.S. Navy's claiming it was a stress test on a nuclear aircraft carrier using what would have been almost $900 million of TNT or a small nuclear weapon. You decide which one it was. It caused earthquakes across Florida. Because questions were asked as to why that explosion occurred, a massive explosion, almost the size of Hiroshima, with no notice at all and no real proof that the aircraft carrier was even within 1,000 miles of there. News stories were buried almost immediately, and because of this, any follow-up on looking at earthquake damage was forgotten entirely. So when this building collapsed, we show 5 people dead, but a massive number of people, more than 100 missing in the rubble. It's because there's extremely deep censorship inside the United States. Now, in other areas involving roads, I live in an area of wealthy, powerful Republicans. So my roads are paved every year. They're quite beautiful. Lake Michigan is right out here. Betsy DeVos lives just over there, and we have parks and boat launches and tennis courts, and all paid for by taxpayers from elsewhere, because we don't pay taxes here. Other people pay for this for us, because I live around wealthy, powerful, corrupt people. And if you can afford to do that, I'd always recommend it. If you live somewhere where people drive to work, or highways where trade occurs, you better be driving a Land Cruiser or something like this, or maybe an armored vehicle, because you're going to be bouncing up and down holes in the road this big around, that deep, everywhere, in specific areas, politically engineered to do this as a form of punishment. And it isn't a new thing in this country. It has always been this way. Public works are ruled by corruption. Public money, tax money, is always stolen in the United States. Everything from the $1,000 toilet seats in airplanes to $300 screwdrivers, anything that spends taxpayer money for things like infrastructure or military, that money is always stolen. It always goes to people who donate to corrupt political candidates, who pay off the people who buy their office by sending them projects. And those projects are always designed to fail. Here in Michigan, it has been a tradition that our concrete roads. Now, if you go to Germany, you can drive on the Autobahns built in 1935. Now, that concrete is brown and ugly and solid as a rock. And it's that thick, but it's been there for that long. Our highways are this thick and made with sand. Our concrete highways need paving every 3 years. We have an identical climate to Germany, but our roads don't last. They're engineered to not last because infrastructure is a racket in the United States. This is a country that's 23, $24 trillion in debt. That's enough money to buy Europe entirely. You could probably buy the people for that, but certainly all of the land, everything there. It's an unimaginable amount of money. And the U.S. exists to an extent as a nation in order to create and service artificial debt based on a currency that is, the US dollar is probably harder to understand than a cyber currency. Where it comes from, who prints it, how 9 European banks controlled by a single family out of the Middle Ages own the Federal Reserve System, how it's against the law to discuss that in this country. It may seem far-reaching, but the corruption that a debt-based currency created is behind massive military spending, an aggressive foreign policy, decaying infrastructure, and a corrupt news media that sets both sides against the other in this country to cripple no one knows who the American people are, what American people think or do, because everything that's reported is reported by news people who, to many of us, seem to be living and reporting on things from another planet. Go ahead.
Okay, my next question actually is about these aggressive policies, since you mentioned about it. We've seen the United States spend about $7 trillion in the Middle East, but why they don't spend it in the United States and try to make intervention outside of its borders?
Well, to an extent, we do spend money here too as well. It's just all stolen. The money is collected or borrowed, in this case, from ourselves. How one does that is an interesting question. It's the nature of fiat currency. And we spend a huge amount of money in this country, and certainly much more. Now, we just recently passed an infrastructure bill pushed by President Biden over extreme objections from the Trump cabal to begin addressing these problems. This will be $1 trillion spent within the United States. The issue, of course, is Congress may have voted the money, we'll borrow it from ourselves, but then where is it going to be spent? What's it going to buy? Where is it going to go? And how much of this is going to go back into the pockets of the politicians who voted for the money, or into the hands of gangsters who sell concrete? What you'll generally find is the infrastructure problem you see in the United States isn't just American. And the problems that cause this occur all over the West. If you were to live in Britain, their infrastructure problem is probably 30 times what ours is. Driving in southeast Britain to go 35 miles, instead of highways, I've actually had to cut through people's yards, drive through gas stations, just to get somewhere. Spent a lot of time in the UK. Lived in Germany for some years. I have children there. Only about 2 years ago were they served by a highway at all. They've been building the same bridge for 11 years. It'll be open soon. And the problems they have in Germany, certainly in Britain, to a lesser degree in France, parallel the problems in the US, and they come from the exact same area, and to an extent, many of the same problems. That doing anything that would be investment in a nation, investment in a people, investment in a culture, investment in an economy, when that interferes with the flow of government borrowed cash into the hands of powerful international banks that rule the world. Anyone who says that's not true is insane. Nations and governments, and this is what it comes down to. Nations and governments, for the most part, exist only to serve banking criminal cartels. The nations wouldn't be here if there wasn't some reason, and it's what we see in the U.S. in our political system. Our leaders in the United States are essentially middle management in world organized crime. No more than this. You know, I made this same talk to a conference maybe 7 years ago in Damascus. Got in a lot of trouble for that because it's the reality. You work for an American security service or the military, it becomes very clear. You are working for an organized crime cartel, and that U.S. government in Washington, senators and representatives and judges and whatever are nothing but window dressing. It's all fakery. If you watch them on TV, they look silly. It's because they are nothing but actors. It's, you know, people talk about false flag terrorism and crisis actors. Well, the U.S. government is crisis actors. It's no more. They're clowns. And they are there to do nothing but distract people for news television shows that are utter and absolute fiction as well. It's like living in science fiction. The window dressing, of course, is that we live in a nation full of minimum wage workers, almost no healthcare system in this country. COVID has shown that. We have 619,000 Americans dead from COVID. You can't get medical care here. It would be easier to people go to Hungary, to Iran for medical care. I should go to Iran for my medical care. I receive better medical care in Syria than I do here. That's another issue, and it deeply parallels the infrastructure, the decaying bridges, the decaying highways, which are in some of the areas of the U.S. that don't have the right people living there.
And now with your comments, it's become meaningful for me. For instance, I heard some news that, for instance, some politicians like Bernie Sanders said that our infrastructures are destroying, and this is a threat for our national security, and we have to focus on these infrastructures issue more than for instance, intervention in other countries. But now, as you say, it seems that some cartels, or for instance, some factories that produce weapons, they prefer wars. You mean?
Well, you know, Sanders is an interesting person to bring up, and many of us wish that Bernie Sanders had managed to stay in the race for president, because as much as people love calling him a communist, everything he says is generally absolutely correct. Now, I do wonder from time to time, why stealing low-grade Syrian oil that we don't need? We have an oil glut here, an unimaginable excess of oil. Why stealing Syrian wheat or burning wheat fields makes the U.S. more secure? You know, I wake up in the morning saying, thank heavens we're sending troops to Syria. They're stealing people's food, because that's going to make this a better place to live, as long as I don't have to drive over one of the bridges. Or why we have these nuclear aircraft carriers everywhere, or a number of our new highest technology ships are so defective you can't take them in the open ocean. They'll turn over and sink. We talked earlier about the USS Gerald Ford aircraft carrier built 5 years ago. It's never worked since. It cost $7 billion. It doesn't function. And if it did, why? What are we going to do? Load it with planes, send it off some little country and scare people? For what reason? And it has been this idea of war. If we go back 52, 53 years ago, I was in South Vietnam taking part in an absolutely childishly insane military conflict there. And the U.S., nothing could be fixed in this country, and no problems of racial injustice could be dealt with, nothing, because we had to focus on a war in order to stop the Vietnamese people from having an elected government and to accept a U.S.-based minority dictatorship run by fascists, which eventually came to take over this country as well. The same thing has happened, and the frustration is that the issues of infrastructure are only one section of a massive healthcare industry in the United States where no one can afford healthcare. A private insurance run, our lives are run by insurance companies. Our homes are insured, our lives are insured by corrupt companies that deregulate themselves through buying our government. That bleeds endless billions out of the U.S. from automobile insurance, insurance on homes. It's another game, but it's one after the other. Infrastructure is only one issue of a nation built entirely to support an artificial economy that is going to have people work at the lowest wages possible, maintain the lowest standard of living acceptable in the U.S., which is higher than most of the rest of the world, to generate massive amounts of money which flow into Washington, D.C., and from there into banks across Europe. For what purpose? None of us understand. None of us understand why this is. But we walk through our lives here as though we're ghosts. You're born here, you do what you're told, and you eventually die, and everything you see or hear through the media and from the government is like it's from a dream world. And only in the last few years is it all accepted as reality. When it comes down to a local level, it's the fact we have unpaved roads or bridges you can see that are rusting, and occasionally one of them falls down. But it's part of a corruption that really has penetrated most of the West as well. Certainly through Canada, certainly through Europe, and that most of the West, as it is, operates under a single managing governing power of the banks that own our governments. And the issues we deal with as far as engineered social discord, engineered meaningless lives, engineered fake events in the press are underscored by nations where if you live where the haves are, you see luxury and beauty and money spent everywhere. And you can drive 20 miles away and you could think you're in a third world country. How this country exists with so much beauty and wealth and excess. And then not so far away, slums, waste, depravity, people living in shacks. it's impossible to understand. I have to go inland here. I'm on the internal seafront, as it were. We call it Third Coast. I go in about 5 miles, and it's a totally different world in there. It looks like some of the worst areas I work in Africa. And people who have no services, and of course we have massive police forces to protect the haves from the have-nots, because the people who live inland aren't allowed here. They can't come here, they couldn't drive here, they couldn't walk here, and whether it's race or anything else, there is a massive divide, a class divide in this country. The problem with that class divide is it is engineered to make the people who theoretically have the economic power as unfeeling as possible, to support oppressive police, oppressive government, and the corruption. And that's returning to your issue of infrastructure, the corruption that's led to inequities in infrastructure spending and healthcare spending. Only does this corruption begin to note when the people who are the haves begin to suffer the consequences. And things under Trump deteriorated to such a point that people who thought they were safe from police because they're white or safe because they live in the right area are finding that that might not be the case anymore. That people, through not caring, not valuing justice, not valuing democratic ideals, have allowed that privilege they thought was going to protect them and make them special, that's finally being eaten away. And to that end, in this country, I think we have fewer crazed armed dissidents than often the media reports, but they're very, very real. And the U.S. is poorly equipped to deal with what has been it's now going to be a smoldering civil war that is going to break out at some point in a mass slaughter in the next 2, 3, 4 years. As the multiple Americas gel, white, wealthy Americans, Americans of color, who are divided in classes but have a permanent oppressed underclass terrorized by American police, and that's what the last year or so has taught many woke Americans, that world has existed for 180 years. It's not a new thing at all in any way, longer than that. That the mess we have created through allowing corruption and turning a blind eye to the idiots that we've allowed to rule ourselves is now going to turn into a shooting war here. And, you know, was President Biden 2 days ago, you know, jokingly said that, you know, the U.S. government is safe against, and I'll call them a crazed minority of armed radicals in this country, but there are millions of them, because the government could use F-15s and nuclear weapons on its own citizens who are certainly morally unfit to live in a democratic society.
Yeah, thank you. I got many details. Thank you for this great interview. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Sorry to bother you.
No, it's been fine.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye.
Paddington.